Hello, Becky.
Hi, Stephen. Hi, Tikan.
No.
All right. Well, we're live.
Wonderful.
So welcome everyone. Welcome to this incredible session. Looking forward to food systems based on traditional ecological knowledge. My name is Tikan Galbraith, and I am excited to be here today facilitating this session with a dear friend of mine, Meda DeWitt. She and I have worked together in food systems up here in Alaska for close to a decade. In that time that I've known her, she has been an incredible advocate and community voice around the importance of being connected to our plants and really engaging with them as the teachers that they are. She is this wealth of knowledge, an incredible community activist, and I'm just so grateful for her in my life and grateful to have her here today to speak to all of you and share some of her wisdom on these traditional ecological knowledge and what it can mean for us in the future in Indian country. And with that, I'll let Meda introduce a little bit more about herself and just welcome everyone. It's an exciting time to be here.
Ganesh Cheesh. Glei ka kleinach Meda DeWitt yuchat duasak, slinget kleinach zetzinak yuchat duasak, nanyai nachatzati, kachari yeri chatzati, shtakin kwan ayachat. My name is Meda DeWitt, and my Tlingit names are Zetzinak and Klot. I have an adopted Inupiaq name from Marianne Warden, which is Tigigaluk, and I have an adopted Cree name from Harry Watchmaker, which is Boss Eagle Spirit Woman. And immediately when I got that name, Tikan just started calling me Bossy or Boss. It was pretty awesome. And I am on Takatnu, which is Dena'ina land. I am in Alaska, and we'll look at some pictures here in a little bit to help center us in space in this conversation. But I also wanted to say thank you, Tikan, for inviting me to speak for IAC for this conference. I really appreciate the work that you have done as well. And I really love working with people who have the same vision and goals together in the long term, because I think that we just amplify each other and lift each other up. So, Ganesh Cheesh. Okay, so I do have to say, I was going to just tell a story today, elder story about the transition, and that will be seeded throughout this conversation today. But the ancestors literally woke me up this morning, first at 2:30, and then I made myself go back to sleep, and I woke up again at 4. And I couldn't sleep. And like, I just saw how the presentation needed to have more of the academic side and how important it is for us to start engaging in our traditional food stories. And so we'll go through this and to give that basis of importance. So I'm not going to read all of the slides, but we'll go through them, and then this will also be recorded so you can refer back later for content. And you're more than welcome to take pictures or screenshot the PowerPoints as we go through. Just if you use the information, please cite it correctly. So looking forward, right, we're looking for our resiliency in a changing world. And in Alaska, we have a huge diversity of people. And I think that's very important when we introduce ourselves, that we help people to understand the vastness of Alaska. Because a lot of times when you look at a map, right, we're situated right in between California and Hawaii, and we're about this big. But when you actually place this over the United States, this is a real size comparison between Alaska and the US. So we may be talking about, down in Southeast or over in the Aleutians, and that's the difference between Florida and California, right? Or we might be talking way up here and you're in, upper Michigan, which is considered what Anwar is to, down in these areas, Texas even. So when we talk about our people, what happens is Alaska Natives get pan-ethnicized a lot of times. And so we have to realize that Not only is Alaska very large, with 20% of the US land mass, we also have almost half, we have 229 tribes of the 567 tribes that are registered in the US, right? We also have a different population matrix because Alaska has such a small population, um, that are 136, almost 150,000 by now people represent 20% of the state's population, whereas in lower 48 there's actually a 2% representation in the overall population. And we don't have reservations. We have one area that is slightly designated as a reservation, but they want to actually thought about more as a reserve, and to honor that, it's Metlakatla. And the rest of the state is non-reservation. We do have tribal lands, and we have corporate lands, federal lands, state lands, private lands. And so we have a lot of different designations that we have to field on a regular basis. Here is a language map for you to look at the different groups. We have 11 different groups and 22 different language variants within those groups. So like all of these all of these red ones are Dene language base, but there's 11 different dialects in that language base. And you can see up here in the corner, we have North America, and there's red in Alaska, in Canada, and the lower 48. And our linguistic anthropologists, they just confirmed what we know in our stories, right? That we have relatives in the lower 48, which are the Navajo and the Apache. The blue language base are the Inuit languages, and those span across Alaska, north of Canada, and over all the way to Greenland. So let's go back here. So down here, we have this like goldenrod color. That's Tlingit, Ani, or Tlingit territory, land is down here. We'll zoom in. And so we have all of these different groups from Copper River down to Haida Gwaii and interior to Yukon territories in Canada. So I wanted to center this conversation from a Tlingit Ani, because I am a Tlingit person and I'll be sharing with you, but I have teachers who are also Yupik, Anupak, Cree, from all over the world who have shared story and helped me to understand how to think about these things appropriately. So science is finally catching up with Indigenous knowledge and things that we knew were coming, right? Most of our groups actually had stories pre-contact that there was going to be a great change coming. And in Tlingit traditions, our medicine people saw that there was a great power coming, and they actually started to adapt some of the ways of thinking so that it wasn't such an abrupt shift over. However, they couldn't safeguard against everything. But it was known that our climate would be affected, right? And we're seeing that now. It's changing rapidly. And in the north, we're actually experiencing it in a faster variation than other places in the world. And so we've been trying to sound the climate alarm for quite a while. But now that it's affecting some of these larger populated areas, it's becoming more and more centered in the majority's conversation. So the climate conditions are impacting behavioral health. And this is where this conversation is going to be centered in as well, is behavioral health and the effects that it has on the person. So we have increased emotional stress, anxiety, trauma, grief, and loss. So some of our villages are already experiencing impacts. We have 4 villages that are have to be moved immediately, and it's actually projected that 80% of our communities are going to have to move because of sea level rise and extreme storm surges. So we have to learn from our ancestors and our elders who adapted to climate change. And these are pretty much the objectives, learning objectives, and we'll go through the information in this presentation. But we have the cultivation of indigenous plants as food and medicine, that's a meaningful way to adapt, and that's the title of our presentation, of course. But how do we think about it in changing climate, and how do we live well? And so this is some of the background that we've been seeing these changes, like I said earlier, for over 60 years. It's become just accepted, right, in the presidential debates and other platforms within just this last year that people are overtly accepting climate change. So we've hit that tipping point in the collective consciousness that more people now believe in climate change than don't believe in climate change, which is good because now we can actually start making changes that we need to make. Um, and just even within this last couple of days in Southeast, where I'm from, Southeast Alaska, we had record rainfall, and places like Ketchikan already get the record for the most rainfall in the United States. We live in a coastal rainforest, and they received 5 inches of rain when in one 24-hour period. In the next 24-hour period, they had 4.5 inches of rain, which caused flooding and landslides. And they're still searching for people down in Haines locations that were lost in the landslides. So what we know is that the precipitation in Alaska is going to increase and our winter seasons are going to grow shorter. Another thing that we know is that's happening this season is the seasonal ice that's in the Arctic that freezes between the pack ice on the pole and the land. It usually is formed in September, but we made it to the end of October without it fully forming. So this is actually the latest on record that's been kept by Western systems of the latest freeze up that we've had in the Arctic. So we're already seeing this in real time this year. Increased precipitation and less ice, which is a destabilization of for lower 48, what's going to happen is those conveyor belts of rain or the conveyor belts of cold or even Pacific Ocean, those are all going to shift and change the way that you experience climate as well. So Wilson Justin is an Athabascan elder, and he's one of our teachers. And when he said this, it made so much sense. He said the climate change started at contact. Colonization was the initiation of an imbalanced relationship with the environment, right? So traditionally, as Indigenous people, it was our job to keep everything in balance. So when contact happened and that mass extraction of fur-bearing animals or of minerals, that's when we started to go out of balance. So for some of us, climate change started 500 years ago. And for some of us, climate change started 100 years ago. So mental health, right? What is mental health? It's a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with normal stresses of life, and can work productively and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. I normally pair this with a thought experiment of traditional foods, the hunting, the gathering, processing, and dissemination to groups, because our traditional life ways actually fit this definition of mental health, of good mental health. So in the positive sense, mental health is a foundation for individual well-being and effective functioning of a community. This is just for reference. This is where I have most of my climate data that I've pulled for this. And I'm not going to read all of these, but I have them in here for your reference that you can pull from if needed. So mental health is stress-related disorders are important health outcomes that are influenced by climate change. The major takeaway in this space that I want you to look at is solastalgia. It's a effect of climate change causing distressing sense of loss that people experience as a result of unwanted environmental changes that occur close to one's home. Now, this is pretty interesting because this was actually, that word was coined in 2007 and written about, but this is something as Indigenous people, we've been trying to explain for a long time, right? We even have those beautifully written sorrowful words of Chief Seattle trying to explain that loss of the animals and the plants and the environment. Um, and so this is what he's expressing. So now we have these terms that we can use. So the mental health and the effects that we're going to see from climate change are going to disproportionately impact people living in low resource settings. Now it's kind of interesting because we actually have traditionally high resource access, but because of the law and policy, we end up being in food deserts and being considered low resource settings. Influences on interpersonal violence, community conflict, and will impact mental health and well-being through changing factors such as the family structure, economic status, and cultural continuity. We're even seeing these kinds of effects, right, from COVID and having to be at home. So a lot of this probably will resonate in what we're experiencing at this day and age. So social distress, psychosocial distress and associated health outcomes may also increase amongst our emergency workers. And again, like I said, we're seeing these outcomes in our COVID responders as well. So people in Alaska have expressed their concern of feeling depression related to the uncertainty of the scope and magnitude of potential climate change. They've expressed anxiety about the impacts of climate change on culture, subsistence, traditional knowledge, and ways of knowing, and increased wildfires, droughts in the Yukon and British Columbia and Alaska. And I wanted to make sure to put that in there because I keep talking about sea level rise and coastal experience, but there's also the interior experience of people who are not living on the coast. And so that's what that wildfires and droughts. We're also seeing the decreased glaciers, snowpack, and in some places increased precipitation. So we've witnessed that over the last few summers where we have those rivers of water right in the atmosphere that dump, and they just dump tons of water. In Houston that happened a few years ago, and it actually there was so much water that it depressed the land, and then when it popped back up we had a rebound earthquake in Mexico. So these things are actually in the traditional stories that many of our elders have told us. So there will be continued impacts on mental health, community wellness, and family structures. And our negative coping mechanisms that are considered maladaptive are actually going to increase if we don't act ahead of time, right? If we are reactive instead of proactive, then it's going to exacerbate the issues that we're already experiencing. Okay, so our mental illness, when we condense it, is affected by decreased food security, damaged infrastructure, economic costs, poor water quality, and extreme storm events. And I wanted to put this in here because for Shinga Ani as coastal people, we've always built right on the coast. Our villages, you walk right out and just above high tide mark. But even with that said, we have communities that are situated up mountains, 100 feet. And we know that they've always been built at coastal level, right? We also have communities that elders have told anthropologists where they're at, and they've done some digging and inspection 70 feet under the water, and the village is located exactly where the elders have said. So we have to frame this context that this is not new to us, right? Now, the speed in which it's happening is new, and the fact that the culture and the structures that we're in is new, but our ability to adapt is not new. And I referenced this kind of earlier. Nearly 90% of Alaskan communities are located on the coastline. We have to, it's actually 86% of our communities are going to have to move, which is 183 communities. And the process of relocation is stressful. And that in itself is causing compounded stress in the process of just figuring out how to navigate law and policy and bureaucracy to find a new place to move. So, what is subsistence? We have to work here within the state system, the federal system, corporate system, tribal system, right? So, they have these definitions of a non commercial, customary, traditional use of wild, renewable resources. Okay, AFN has subsistence as the hunting, fishing, and gathering activities, which traditionally constitute economic base for life for Alaska Native people. And then elders will simply say it's our way of life, right? Or ha kusti, which conceptually means that we're doing things as our ancestors have done them, in the ways and the times that they did them. So it's our way of life, it's our entire being. So things that we'll be dealing with, right? Rising food prices, challenges to food quality and quantity, and changing food distribution patterns. And just within this last year, we've seen how fragile our structures are. In Alaska, our shipping, we have 95% of our food and goods shipped in, and it generally comes through the port of Anchorage. And we only have about 3 to 5 days of enough resources in the stores for communities. And so we have 2 port arrivals each week. We have one on Sunday and then we have one on Tuesday. And that brings in the majority of the goods for the whole state. And it's kind of a joke up here because when the pandemic hit, we were going to have to hunker down. Everybody bought up the toilet paper. All of our stores were out of toilet paper. And now we're looking at another hunker down mode in Anchorage. And guess what? All the toilet paper is gone. All right. So looking at our relatives, right? The animals, there's going to be a northward shift of seal and fish species. There's going thinning sea ice, which we talked about earlier. It's already happening. Reduced river ice. And that actually not only does it make harvesting wild foods more precarious, it's like sometimes they're not even there, or it's dangerous to do the activity in the spot that we've always done it. And there's increased ocean temperatures and permafrost changes. So the permafrost is frozen ground. And for Alaska, it's been incredibly important to food preservation for people above the Arctic Circle. So it used to be that permafrost started 3 inches under the ground, and now you have to dig down 9 feet, which means those traditional cellars that people used to keep whale in, fish in, other foods in, are not available anymore. Okay, so addressing climate change as a public health issue. It's looking at this in a pragmatic way. How do we deal with it? So scientists, clinicians, public health professionals are called for attention to climate change on both practical and ethical levels. So you have 2 different interventions. There's a primary prevention correspondent, and that's mitigation to slow the effects or stabilize or reverse climate change. And then there's a secondary and tertiary, which is adaptation. So with this in mind, I also want to talk a little bit about historical trauma, because we were saying with Justin, that our experience of climate change started at contact. And now we have the knowledge that our experience of loss of our land or connectivity with our land is called solastalgia, right? So we start being able to put these things together to create a narrative of us understanding what we've been dealing with and being able to explain it in a way that we can start structuring our healing around it as well. So historical trauma is the total collective emotional and psychological wounding over a lifespan and across generations, stemming from massive group trauma, either acute or chronic. Intergenerational trauma are the wounds caused in new generations from the trauma past generations still carry. So for us, the way that I explain this is boarding schools. Our children were required to go to boarding schools all the way up until 1971. Molly Hooch won in the Supreme Court the ability to not be shipped off to the boarding school. So many of our boarding schools, we've had those stories come out, right, in the last decade about how traumatic it was for our elders and the amount of loss associated with that. But to understand, like, who do we learn how to be parents from? The people who parented us, even if they weren't our biological parents. The boarding schools were the parental figure that our elders had. And so when they left boarding school, they brought those same concepts of parenting with them. And so that behavior, even if you're trying to undo it, still infuses in your parenting structures. So Jim LaBelle, who was a teacher here in Alaska, an elder that's highly respected, he talks about how when he had children, he only knew how to be a parent until they were about an age 5, because when he was 5, he went to the boarding school. And so after that, he realized he didn't even know what to do, and he had to learn and educate himself on parenting after that point. And so you have the behaviors that are passed down and epigenetic changes. And then you have persisting trauma. And we talk about persisting trauma in the social, economical, institutional, and judicial factors that perpetuate the original historical impacts, right? So for instance, we have the doctrine of discovery that was used to come over and basically made anybody who was non-Christian non-humans. And that document allowed the enslavement and murder of indigenous people and the removal of their lands. That document was also used in the Supreme Court in the late 1800s in the original creation of Indian law. So we have this pervasive, overtly racist, genocidal doctrine that created the foundation of law and policy that we're experiencing today. And we know that if our people are brought into the system, that they generally stay in the system. So for instance, in Alaska, 63% of our foster care system are Alaska Native children. And then you get into the judicial system, 40% of the adult population in our judicial system is Alaska Native men. And so that's that like continuation of that historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, and situations, right? Bureaucracy and laws and policies that keep that in place. So stress, a lot of people in the behavioral health world have heard about epigenetics, and I'm hoping that other different careers and paths learn about epigenetics too. It's a stress response to act, either good or bad. You know, planning a birthday party could either create a stress response. Getting into a car accident also creates a stress response. But trauma occurs when you're not able to mitigate or cope with the stressor, right? Stress is normal, even when we're doing good things, but it's when we can't mitigate or cope. So prolonged exposure to stress changes with physical, mental, and spiritual aspects of a person. With enough intensity or duration of the stressor, the event can change your epigenetics. So your epigenetics isn't your DNA, it's the coding on the outside of your DNA that tells your genes whether or not to express. And it's a gradient, it's not just on or off. And so what happens is you can have stressful or traumatic events coded in your DNA. And as Indigenous people, we know this, right? It's blood memory or memory of our ancestors, historical traumas. We know that it's coded in the DNA. And Dr. Ann Bullock, which actually she should be cited on this page, works with IHS in chronic disease prevention. And so what's found is if you have this epigenetic changes due to trauma, that you yourself and your offspring can have increased prevalence of chronic disease. So it's imperative for us and our future generations that if we see a traumatic event coming, that or we're experiencing one, that is imperative that we mitigate it. So action feels better than anxiety. In September, there was an NPR story where they were looking at climate grief, and they were looking at solastalgia, and they were doing research into these experiences. And what they found is that one of the major mitigating or coping strategies that helps to protect yourself from experiencing too much trauma is action. And he said being, social justice and environmental advocacy, those are all protective factors in helping you so that you don't have these long-term effects of the stress. So migration stories, right? We have to learn from our elders on how are we supposed to get through this, because we've done this before. This is not new to us. And each one of our cultural groups has migration stories that we can learn from. I will not share the exact story with you, but I can talk about our migration story. It's one of our sacred stories. So the Tlingit people, we have stories that recount these difficult situations. And those situations could have been classified as historical trauma, but instead the story is one of our strengths. It's our power story. It's who we are and how we became Tlingit people. Used to be in the interior, and then with the glacial retreats, the climate started to change at the place that we were at, and the food systems crashed, and we actually had to go out to the coast. And we had two young men run over the glacier to see if there was anywhere to go, and they reported back. And then there was a river that went under the glacier, and the people, they couldn't travel over the glacier. It was too dangerous, and they had to go under. So two old women volunteered to go under for their community. And so in this process, they didn't leave interior because of, just happenstance. There was no food, people were starving, there was disease, mass grief. So they did ceremony and they said goodbye to the land, and they cleaned up where they lived, their village sites and campsites, and they prepared it for their exit. And then they did grief and cry songs for the old women because they may not make it, but they were going to see if it was a safe passage for the community. And they did actually make it under the glacier. And the two scouts who went over confirmed that they made it and came back and told the community. And then the whole community got into their canoes and went under the glacier. So it could have been a traumatic story, but it's one of our greatest stories of strength. And the difference between historical trauma and stories of resilience is sovereignty. They had the ability to identify what was wrong, speak about it truthfully, and make a plan to transition to a new space. And then they enacted that plan, right, with self-governance and autonomy as a group. So that's what we have to do now. We're learning from our stories. We have to clean up our space. We have to move forward with courage. We have to create a plan together. Our old stories are associated with geological time. They have incredible challenges. And sovereignty right now is us taking back our story of strength. Right? Adaptation and indigenous thing. That's how we lived so well for 10,000 plus years. In Shinga Ani, we know that we've been around for more than 20,000 years. So how do we adapt? What kind of stories do we have? And Tikan's been with me for a long time. We've listened to elders. He actually was one of the foundational partners for Alaskan Plants as Food and Medicine, where we brought people from around the state and the country together to talk about our traditional plants as food and medicine, and basically started a revolution revitalizing our plant medicines. And during those times, we sat with medicine people, we sat with elders, and they had a platform to tell us the things that they needed to say and to be taken seriously. And what did we learn? They said that Alaska is going to be warm again. okay? We have a cultural memory of Alaska being warm before. And they also talk about that people are going to be coming to the indigenous people wanting to learn how to live because we hold that key to being in balance with nature. And Dr. Rita Blumenstein, who's one of our teachers here in the state, she's Yupik. And, she says the plants are going to be moving north. Be prepared to bring up the best ones. So it's when we start hearing these climate scientists and they start talking about, and this is my take from listening to my elders, but when they start talking about reversing climate change, I know it's not the way that it's going to turn out because in our traditional ecological knowledge and our stories is that Alaska is going to become warm again, and our earth is going to be like water world, so we'll have incredible amounts of water, and we're not going back to being cold, at least not for a long time, not within our perceived future. So our culture is a culture of wellness, right? We have to look at it for recovering, and the basic stages of trauma and recovery is safety and stabilization. So we get right down into that hierarchy of needs that Maslow stole from the Blackfeet, right? What's that base layer is a safe place to live, food, water, somewhere to sleep. And so that's the foundational that we need to instill for our people. And we have to remember and mourn. So we can't just tell people to get over it, right? We have to acknowledge the truth of what's happened. And we have to allow ourselves to grieve. In a traditional story, they grieved, they had cry songs. And then when they came out to the coast, they had the reciprocal balancing songs of gratitude and lifting each other up. And we have to reconnect and integrate ourselves with our community into this new future that we're going to choose together and we're going to co-create. Here's a little bit of nerdy science for everybody. So the vagus nerve is the longest nerve in the body, and it's primarily associated with resting and digestive system. Um, and our tone of our vagus nerve is really important because that's how fast it can bounce back after being in stress. So the vagus nerve actually helps you to relax. So we think of relaxing as a passive state of not doing anything, but that's not true in the body. It's actually facilitated through the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system. So, we have these fight or flight responses, and the vagus nerve helps pull us out of that fight or flight response. And so I just read this paper. Actually, I had Tom McRoberts send it to me because I teach about traditional health-based practices for behavioral health providers in a class every semester. And he said he found this paper and it substantiated pretty much everything that I said. I just kind of laughed. I was like, okay, cool. Well, we know, right? Um, so ways to stimulate that vagus nerve, cold exposure. Traditionally, we call it dipping, but also we lived outside on a regular basis. All of our people spent more time outside than they did inside. Ways to help, invigorate that vagal nervous system is that deep, slow breathing, singing, humming, chanting, and gargling. I don't know that we gargled, but our drumming, right? Our singing, our dancing, that helps to tone the vagus nerve as well. Probiotics, which nowadays, people take pills or eat yogurt, but traditionally we used to ferment food to help keep it stored through the winter. And those were our probiotics. Whether it was ooligan oil that was rendered or seal grease or fermented fireweed shoots, we had lots of kinds of foods that were fermented that helped create those probiotics and prebiotic state. Meditation, which traditionally we had facilitated meditation. It was, always being present. Meditation wasn't all the time something separate. It was integrated into um, how to become a good hunter. It was integrated into our seclusionary rites of passage. Meditation was integrated in as prayer. So we have all these different cultural versions of meditation. Omega-3 fatty acids, which we find in our food, exercise, massage, and socializing and laughing, right? And socializing and laughing is kind of that core feature of Indigenous communication. So, with our relationship to the environment, right? When we're raised in an environment with the stories and lineage of relationship, the environment is an extension of ourself and our community. And it becomes a primary teacher and connector to spirituality. And this is really important to connect to protective factors associated with ACEs, or adverse childhood effects. And um, I'm not going to go through all the science about that because I want to stay on time, but the most protective factor that you can have against a high ACE score is a good caregiver, which in our traditional concepts, Mother Earth and nature is a living being that you create relationship. And so it actually counts as one of those highest grade protective factors against negative experiences in your life. So these are traditional strategies that go along with what I just read with the vagal nerve. And I'm not going to read through all of these because we are getting close to our time. But right, we need our language because our traditional stories in our traditional language, have science embedded in them. We can learn about the behaviors and activities that we did in times of stress or starvation or migration and apply those to where we are now. They're still relevant. And then talking through story, right? When we tell story, it helps to access a different part of our brain than just rote learning memorization. And it's an essential part of who we are. And it says Northern Indigenous people, but all Indigenous people. Storytelling is part of our traditional psychology. And we have different grades of storytelling that are meant to be told in different ways. So meeting these base needs, right? What's the concept of a traditional chief? Well, we have the duty that is community wellness. Our leaders are only as strong as our weakest person, right? We're only supposed to move as fast as our slowest person. We are judged against the suffering of our most vulnerable. So if you have people who are hungry in your community, your leaders are no better than that level. They can only be elevated when the people at the lowest are elevated as well. And food, water, medicine, clothing, and shelter for all of our people. Because if we're going to say that we're all valuable, we're all worthy, we're all loved, then we actually have to show it in our physical activities and actions. And that sense of love and community is what is the main part of us living through this and living through it well and coming out stronger with epic stories, right? Our teens are vital to moving forward. And this is, as a plant person and traditional healer, people laugh when I start talking about tech, but we need to integrate tech into helping us manage our food systems. So we need to grow locally, we need to grow on our reservations and at our homes, and it's going to be more productive by integrating these systems that can help project precipitation and water, like water the plants, and also climate modeling to help us understand how things are going to change and where they're going to change. So according to our traditional stories, we've known that the arid areas are going to move north or south from the equator. We know that the plants are going to move on their own as well. And we can see that by data modeling showing us, there's these trees that are moving west and north. These patterns of our jet streams are changing and these polar vortexes are changing. So I think that our youth are a critical part of helping to envision a new way forward. Okay, so we are in the midst of an epic migration story. We aren't going back. And if you learn anything from this presentation, you need to take that away with you, as we're not reversing climate change. We're moving forward, and we need to move forward with courage and wisdom from our elders and to help work through this process and becoming real human beings again. And stories will be told about us because we are the legendary ancestors, and you are a legendary ancestor, and you're going to be part of the story of transitioning into a healthy future. Finish. Sheesh. Okay, T-Con, what are your thoughts?
Oh my goodness, Mina, that was fantastic. I really appreciate everything that you shared, and that lens of behavioral health and how it connects to this transition that we're all experiencing. Is it solastalgia, that word? Just like
I always say it wrong. I always say solasthesia, but I think it's solastalgia.
yeah, however it's pronounced, it really just resonated with me, and just like, it sounded like it was a light bulb for you, and it definitely was for me. It was just like, yes, I am experiencing that, and that is happening. And I really, I just appreciated, having that context in the history of everything, and the academic perspectives that you shared.
Yeah, and then
Um,
leading with our elders because they're scientists and they have field experience, 15,000 years of field experience on the coast that we need to listen to.
we did have a question come in from one of our viewers, and they were asking to hear the quote again or see the quote of the difference between trauma being sovereignty. I think it was
Oh,
very
yeah.
powerful.
Yeah, let's find that. Mhm. Sorry, I'm having to flip through windows here and get to
Worries. And while you're looking for that, um, you were talking about intergenerational trauma, and I'm curious. I kind of feel like it can be, but can that perspective be flipped? Can it be intergenerational healing? From the story that you shared about the Tlingit creation story, it really seems like everything can be reframed. So I'm curious from your perspective, what does that look like? What does reframing our current story look like through the lens of traditional ecological knowledge?
Right. Well, and that this is the reframing, right? So sovereignty is the difference between a historical trauma versus a historical strength. And the process, we, kind of spoke to that in here, if I can find it, of being proactive, right? Telling ourselves the truth of what's actually happening, accepting it, and then making a plan together to move forward. So that's how we turn it into a strength because, and kind of interesting one of the things, this is so Tlingit, right? When I was going through this process of trying to understand what was happening from all the different stories and data, and even doing ceremony and asking for perspective to understand, is that, that, like I said, this is so Tlingit, but we're preparing for a good death. So what does that mean? If you're going to transition with dignity and honor, and we're going to let go of all of these things that no longer serve us or that are holding us back, what is that process to move forward? And so, first of all, is accepting that this is real and then communicating with each other on how do we want to move forward as a group and what parts of ourselves do we want to take with us? What narrative are we going to choose? And you can't ignore the negative things, right? But you can help to come out of that trauma response and work to understand and then forgiving. And forgiving isn't a forgetting issue. Forgiving isn't, carte blanche letting go. It's forgiving is understanding what happened and also allowing yourself to no longer hold on to negative emotions in association. Because as long as you're holding on to that negativity internally, it's actually going to draw your spirit from you and reduce your energy and your capacity for moving forward. So we have to understand and we have to work to heal and we have to allow ourselves to let go and to transition into the future. Um, and so here's the story of, sovereignty, right? Instead of a story of trauma. So hopefully I answered your question, Tikan, and also the listener.
Absolutely. Yeah, you did for sure. And I felt that and realized it as you were presenting that you were offering that solution. But I really like it when you boil it down and distill it into those Meda gems of wisdom. So,
Gonna
thank you for sharing in that different perspective. Um, we have some comments. There's a request to go back to the vagus nerve slide.
All right. More than happy to. And on these slides, a lot of them you'll see I'll have the links to where you can find them on the web. So here's the first one. And remember,
And
you can,
while you're sharing, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, remember, you can screenshot these if you would like. Go ahead, Tikan.
So we have another question coming in while people are digesting the vagus nerve information. Before I move on, I really just love the stimulate the vagus nerve, and like I could really see how it applies to the actions that we all do as producers and farmers, wild harvesting. Like it's in there and it's in our actions and daily, and so to have that reinforcement that our work in Indian country and across the nation really is healing for us and for the community. So yes. So we have a question. COVID restrictions are hitting hard our isolated elders and young non-partnered adults. What more can we do when we don't have community wellness as we know our customers, especially when these groups are meant to shape our future?
Yes, and
So
you did cut out a little bit. I don't know if it's my internet connection or yours, but it is definitely challenging, and there's not going to be any perfect answer because there is no replacement for human to human interaction. We've evolved, over hundreds of thousands, millions of years to be social beings. And touch is so important that they found that if children don't have enough appropriate touch, that their brains don't form appropriately. And our social bonding doesn't form appropriately. And our ability to adapt to stress is reduced if we don't have enough of that bonding and positive touch as babies. So we cannot replace it, but we can people know that we love and care for them. Now, there's phone calls, there's Zoom calls, there's dropping off gift baskets for people. I know in Southeast Alaska, one of our counterparts, Vivian Mork, all summer she did socially distanced hike and harvest classes, and she actually wore a microphone and had a speaker so people could hear her because she's very soft spoken. There's social distancing gatherings where people will sit outside. It's kind of cold for that right now. But also we do have a vaccine on the horizon. It's going to be distributed. And I know some people associated with Pfizer, and what they were saying is that when they did their studies, they included 1% of their study population as Indigenous people to make sure that there wasn't any adverse effects in Indigenous people. So they went through those extra steps, and I'm looking forward to being able to see people in person again. But for now, you can, bake goodies, you can drop off care packages, you can do Zoom yoga together, or singing and dancing, beading, all sorts of activities. And I think I lost Tikan. So I think his internet went out just a little bit, and we're coming up to the last few minutes. We have about 5 minutes left. Oh, there he is. He's hopping back on. We lost you.
Yeah, I apologize for that. Something going on with my computer.
Yeah. So I just finished answering that one question. Is there any more?
Are 1 second. We have mostly comments.
Okay.
All right. So the prevailing food, let's see. You still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Sorry. Okay. So traditional foods and working plant foods and medicines has been the only real and best medicine for my personal journey through traumas and stress. Thank you for this presentation. So just a shout out of appreciation for the content that you've shared. I am Deg Hitan Dene, and Grandma Sophie was from Anvik. Thank you so much. I'm interested in helping preserve my people's creation and migration stories. I too have been given the stories from spirit world, and I want to preserve the elders' stories. So you're inspiring lots of people to take action and continue the work that they're doing. And then here's a two-part question. The prevailing view on food seems to be one where food is seen as a commodity to be produced en masse and sold to the highest bidder on international markets. Food policy reflects this. What sorts of shifts in policy do you think are needed to promote the adoption of tech and indigenous foodways as opposed to food as a commodity?
Yes. Well, food, it is done that way. However, because of the destabilization of climate, the only way to safeguard our food production is by diversification and stratification. So we need gardens anywhere that we can put a garden. We need to be planting trees, especially food-bearing trees, because what's going to happen is we're going to have large swaths of land, in particularly the place that's considered our bread baskets at this time, who we've just seen, right, with the fires in California. But we're going to have more of these events. And so the more diversification and the growing our own food, more important. And one of the things I'd like to see is the exchange of different foods between different groups. So for instance, seed saving and seed bartering, where they have wild rice growing, I would like to see if it would grow, just a little bit further north. Um, and see if you can help it to inhabit those spaces. And bringing back our traditional indigenous burning practices, which up here we use to help keep our berry patches healthy and to reduce wildfire, which then ensured better hunting and fishing because there was less devastation of the environment and less loss of animal lives.
Great. I think that's a wonderful response. And unfortunately, we are out of time. I think you really have piqued people's interest. There's asked for the PowerPoint to be shared. Just for anybody looking to connect more with Meda, her email is in her bio, as are all the speakers. So if you want to connect directly with any of our speakers, please check out the bio listing. And I'm sure she would be willing to share, as she said, take screenshots and doing the good work. So just proper reference, as always, respect where the knowledge comes from. Meda, thank you so much for being here today. I am so grateful for your words and the lessons that you offered.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I also want to thank our sponsors for making this available. So it's a big thank you for all of the sponsors of this conference that allow us to be here today. And this session was sponsored by Champions of Native Agriculture, as well as the Midwest Organic and Sustainable Education Services. So thank you so much for helping to support this session and allowing the knowledge to be shared to our sponsors. And thank you, Meda, for being here today and sharing your words.
I'll see you again. Iguayachan, go in courage.